problem as the last time, but yesterday everything worked fine. So nobody, just Emily, left the meeting, but it happens by the control of Google Meet. I don't know if they still have technical problems, but yes, we are starting recording.
No problem. Let's begin. Hi there. Hi everyone. It's very, very good to see all of you, even if I cannot see all of you at the same time. And here from our Laboratory of Classical Studies of the University Federal Fluminense, we are very glad and honored for having you with us today or tonight at some places. First of all, I will do a plow time routine in this thing. First of all, very thankfully, I have to thank those who deserve my colleagues here, all of them, but in special Gracie Drummond, who is a brilliant Greek scholar and who takes care of this sequence of web seminars that we are promoting since April. This one now is if I'm not wrong, is the 11th of them. And the first one to cover international range. So we are very honored and proud of that. Gracie, do you want to say some more institutional words?
Yes, welcome everybody. Thank you so much, Giuseppe Pezzini, for being here, for giving a bit of your time, especially in this moment that we are in quarantine. It's a difficult and hard time for us, Brazilians especially. Yes, and other countries too, but we are in a very difficult moment. It's a great pleasure to have this meeting with you. Thank you, Beethoven, for the presentation. Thank you for the support. All my colleagues from the laboratory. Renata is here. Gloria is here. I cannot see, as Beethoven said, I cannot see everybody. So sorry if I don't if I forget someone. Fabio's here. Welcome, Fabio. Great. And thank you so much, also Giuseppe. Good evening for everybody who is maybe, I don't know, UK or even in Italy. I give the technical support here. So just to say, I will not speak much. And yes, thank you so much, Giuseppe. If I can call you Giuseppe.
Please call me back. Call me back.
Okay.
Call me back. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Beethoven.
So, secondly, I thank so much Beppe for having accepted so kindly this invitation. And I also would like to thank him for the time I spent in St. Andrews for a postdoc research project under his supervision. It was brilliant and very, very important for me. Thirdly, I thank Eloise Moreira. I don't know if she's here, but I believe so. She helped me to translate into Portuguese the handout that I hope all of you have received. If not, as Grace said before, there is a link for it in the chat here. I thank you all again, all our online audience, for attending this web seminar, colleagues and friends from many places in Brazil, many places throughout the world. We are very, very glad to see you. So looking forward to hearing what Beppe has to say. I must say before that after his talk, we may have some discussion, and I suggest that the questions or observations can be even video or audio, but each one feel free to participate in whatever way you could. For Portuguese speakers, you can ask in Portuguese, and we find a way to translate that if you need. Para quem quiser no final fazer pergunta em português, a gente pode arranjar jeito de traduzir isso para o inglês. It's worth to remark that Dr. Giuseppe Pezzini is a senior lecturer in the University of St. Andrews, and his main project nowadays is an edition of and the commentary Terence, Realtum Timor Menos, which he is preparing for the Cambridge Orange series, with support of the Lobby Classical Library Foundation Fellowship and the British Academy Research Fellowship. His curriculum is vast. He has a strong expertise in variation of Latin both as the language of Rome, written and spoken, and as the lingua franca of Europe until the 16th century. And he is also interested in ancient philosophy of language and theory of fiction. With what? His talk today, Deconstructing Comedy, Terence on Realism, is connected. So, willing not to waste more of your time, ladies and gentlemen, my dear Beppe, the online stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Beethoven. It's a pleasure to be here, even if virtually. And as Beethoven was saying, I really would like to have this as a moment of dialogue between us. So I also strongly recommend you to use the chat if possible, because I wouldn't say I'm able to understand Portuguese, but I think if you write Portuguese, I think I should be able to figure it out. So if you have any question during the course of my presentation, just fire them off, put them in the chat, and I will get back to it at the end. I really looking forward to your questions. So my topic of tonight, or actually tonight for me, but for your afternoon, is realism. As I said in the title, I want somehow to deconstruct comedy. What I mean by that, I refer to what is nowadays, and even more what has been for centuries, the standard interpretation of ancient comedy in general and of Roman comedy in particular, and more specifically of Terence. And indeed, tonight I'm going to talk about Terence. I will refer also to Roman comedy. I will refer to a bit of Menander, a bit of Plautus, but my main focus is Terence because, as Beethoven was saying, he's been, in a sense, a friend for many years, and I would like to move on at a certain point, but when I'm done with the comment, but for many years he's been a friend, and I'm happy to share this friendship with you tonight. And as I was saying, Terence has been for centuries considered as the champion of realism, and if you can follow on the handout, you see that I put a few quotations there, according to which the comedy of Terence is the one restrained and naturalistic par excellence, is the realistico borghese comedy, and more specifically is the kind of realistic comedy which is normally contrasted with the comedy of Plautus, which instead is not a realistic at all, but it's a sort of pure farcical joke. There is no connection with reality whatsoever. And there is this narrative, and I put a couple of quotes. Some of them very recent. I can read you the second one, which illustrates well this kind of narrative. And I'm quoting from Fontaine, from the Blackwell Companion to Terence. Terence boldly reformed Rome's rich tradition of commedia. He all but eliminated its polymetric musical showpieces and its other perceived excesses, the various sing-song meters, rollicking jokes, general buffoonery, and above all, its exuberant verbal style. The result, and that's the part which matters, is greater realism in speech, ethics, psychology, and sentiment, heightened suspense, and thus, in a word, drama as we know it. So you see, this is from a companion to Terence. So I'm pretty sure there are around the world hundreds of thousands, perhaps, of students who, in a way, still kind of have this sort of reception of the comedy of Terence. And this reception is very ancient, in fact. It's not really dating to the 21st century, but can be traced back to antiquity, and in particular can be traced back to one very important commentary, which is the commentary of Donatus, a 4th century AD collection of notes on Terence. Not all of these are original, but nowadays they are all referred to as belonging to Donatus' commentary. And Donatus' commentary begins with a very short treatise on comedy, which perhaps you're already familiar with. And in this treatise, Donatus quotes an opinion of Cicero, which I'm going to read now. And Cicero says, I'll read it in English, but you can follow the Latin original if you want. Cicero says that comedy is an imitation of life, a mirror of custom, and an image of truth, a speculum imaginem veritatis. And he said that it is a mirror of everyday life, and rightly so, for us when we look at a mirror, we can easily collect through the image the lineaments of truth. So by reading comedy, we can perceive with no effort an imitation of life and custom. These words of Donatus, which he attributes to Cicero, even if these words are not really extant in Cicero's text as we have them, but this idea has influenced the reception of Terence for more than 1,000 years. We can say that this idea, which has been condensed by the image of the speculum vitae, the speculum consuetudinis, is a collection of ideas that can be traced in other Latin authors. And I put in the handout a selection of this, in Quintilian, in Horace, in Gellius, in this other 4th century grammarian Theodorus, and all of them somehow evoke or allude this sort of idea of comedy as a mirror of life. I want to move on to Terence quickly, so we won't focus on these particular pieces of text, but we'll simply sum up that we can, if we put together all the different testimonies, we can somehow reconstruct this reception of comedy as a realistic genre. And according to this, comedy is an enjoyable, comprehensive imitation of the real, basic behavior of human beings in their daily life, which may serve as a model from human behavior. And this final clause, it's important because in this reception of Terence, still popular nowadays, the idea of realism is strongly connected to the idea of exemplarity. What's the point of reading the comedies of Terence? One sees the way people behave, good people and bad people, and for that very reason, we can learn how to behave in real life and even in fictional life. So, for instance, the passage from Quintilian, which I was referring to before, does not come from a real context, but comes from, if you want, a performative context. Quintilian wants to teach the orator how to behave, how to pretend to behave in a particular way, how to do prosopopeia, we will say, and that's why the comedy, and especially the comedy of Menander, will be very useful for that. I put you also here in the handout some notes from the commentary itself of Donatus. These are just a selection because there are in fact hundreds, if not even thousands of notes like this, where we have Donatus praising Terence for being a realistic writer, realistic and therefore useful for moral and didactic purposes. So what I'm going to do for this paper, what I want to do is to, if you want, to challenge this interpretation, or I will say better, to deconstruct this kind of reception, reading Terence as primary evidence for the reconstruction on his own opinion on realism. In fact, we know that, as many scholars have pointed out, that there are many meta-theatrical references in Terence. Terence is one of the authors in Roman comedy, in Latin literature in general, with a clear meta-theatrical perception of what he's doing. And a very important sign of this, as we're going to see later on, is his own particular, distinctive, complex view on the relationship between comedy and realism. So we'll move now straight away to part 2, which is, if you want, the body, the meat of my paper tonight. And I will start saying, as you can see on the handout, that there is explicit evidence that Terence considered realism as a quality of a good comedy. And I'm now referring to number 3 in the handout. As you know, Terence wrote some prologues to his comedies, which are not really connected with the rest of the play, or at least not openly so. And these prologues can be considered, if you want, the very first pieces of literary criticism, and specifically of theatrical criticism. And in these prologues, Terence attacks his rival, who is known as Lucius Lanuvinus, by pointing some flaws in his comedies. And the typical flaw that Terence identifies in Lucius' works is indeed a lack of realism. I can refer, for instance, to the prologue of the Eunuchus, where Terence criticizes his rival, which here remains anonymous, for having staged, as you can see, a trial in which the plaintiff speaks after the defendant and not before him, as instead happens in real life. What is the implied premises of this sort of criticism is that it is a technical or even formal expectation of comedy, of the comic playwright, to give an image of reality, an accurate image of reality, to look like reality. Since in the real world, the plaintiff speaks before the defendant and not vice versa, it is an artistic, a technical vice to portray a different, unrealistic practice. We can see the same kind of concern for realism in another prologue, which is the prologue of the Phormio. And in the same prologue, we have Terence disparaging again his rival, this time for staging a young madman talking to a flying dove. And it's quite clear that in comedy, which is realistic, we cannot have fantastic stuff like this. There is also this kind of anti-realistic criticism in my own comedy, which is the Heauton Timor. It's not so clear as in the other two, but let me briefly refer to it because it's a passage which is quite familiar to me. I've been working a lot on that. It's a kind of problematic passage, and in particular, line 31 that you can see on the handout is heavily discussed. It's not very clear, actually, what Terence is doing here, and it's also quite possible that there is a text of corruption. What seems to be quite clear, however, as pointed out by several scholars like Goldberg, for instance, for Sander Goldberg, it's quite clear, well, it seems quite clear at least, that the vitium, the vice of the comedy of Luscius, which is reprimanded by Terence, consists in the unrealistic absurdity of an audience which makes way to a running slave. This is, of course, if you want, a standard situation in Roman comedy, but we have here criticism, if you want, of an exaggeration of this scene where the slave jumps into the audience and goes around. This kind of break of the meta-theatrical wall is, if you want, criticized by Terence in this prologue as, again, a technical vice, which makes the comedy of his rival a bad one. So we can start from this kind of, if you want, positive idea of realism, which, as we've seen, is very standard in the reception of comedy from the ancient world to nowadays. But the problem is that traces of Terence's interest in realism and credibility in general are not just found in the prologue, and I'm now moving to number 4 in the handout. And I will start focusing on a key passage from the Andra, the first of Terence's comedies, and this is from, if you want, a kind of prologic section in which the slave Davus is deliberating whether to take the side of the young lovers of the play, who are called Pamphilus and Glycerium, or rather to stay with his old master, his powerful master Simo. It's a typical comic play, so there are two lovers who have a problem, and the slave is put in charge of solving the issue. But there is a kind of a difference according to the convention, because in this particular play, it is the lover themselves who have come out with a plan without even asking permission and the help of the slave. So after this deliberative model, Davus, the slave Davus, begins to expand on the love story between Pamphilus and Glycerium and adds important information to the audience, which is still unknown to them. And I'm going to read, and I'm going to read again in English, but let's see if I have, yes, I think I put you a translation on the handout. Yes, I will, but if you please do follow the translation in Latin if you wish. That's not the end of my troubles, because this girl from Andros, Glycerium, the sweetheart of the play, whether she's his wife or his mistress, is pregnant with Pamphilus. And just listen to what a nerve they've got. It's the project of loonies, not lovers. They have decided to let the baby live, whatever it turns out to be, whether a male or a female that is. And now the pair of them are making up some bogus story that she's a citizen of Attica. And they start with a story, with this kind of typical formula. Once there was an old man in the import-export business. He was shipwrecked off the island of Andros. He lost his life. And then she was washed ashore and taken in by his fathers as an orphan child. Fabulae, like Latin says, stories, we could even say comedies. I certainly don't find it plausible, but they are pleased with their story. This is a very beautiful passage. I like it very much. And it's quite clear that this passage has a strong meta-theatrical ring. As you can see, if you follow the Latin, we have a verb, which is the verb fingere, which is a very typical technical term for the act of inventing a plot in particular, and in general for the theatrical act. We also have the narrative stock phrase fulit olim, which is equivalent to once upon a time. Also, the general asyndetic style of lines 2-1 and 2-3 is quite artificial, but also what makes the meta-theatrical ring coming out in very clear terms is the noun line 224, fabulae, which in comedy and in Terence in particular is the technical term to refer to the comic play. It's not just that, it's not just the language which makes this passage meta-theatrical. The whole story, which has been concocted by Pamphilus and Glycerium, is in fact the typical and stereotypical, we may say, plot of a new comedy. It's a plot which features a a recognition, an anagnosis of an orphan girl as a daughter of an Athenian citizen, and then at the end, she's allowed to marry his lover. So if you read Roman comedies, there are many comedies which have the kind of similar plot. What I find, however, interesting is that Davos comments on this, if you want, stereotypical plot, and the comment is, if you want a critical comment, a piece of criticism from Davos is that he does not find this plot realistic, and yet the two playwrights of the Andria are pleased with the story. So you see there is an aesthetic component for something which, however, is not realistic at all. We may say, therefore, that according to Davos, the comic plots are not plausible, are not realistic. What do we do with that? Should we kind of relate this sort of anti-realistic criticism to the same anti-realistic criticism which we have seen in the prologue? As it is Davos here as a mouthpiece of Terence criticizing the plot of other unrealistic playwrights? It seems quite possible, because we have seen that Terence is concerned with realism and is ready to criticize the lack of realism of other writers. The problem with this is that almost all the comedies of Terence feature the same version of their anagnosis plot, which is here disparaged by plot Davos, and not just all the other comedies, but this very comedy, Andria, is in fact anticipated. The plot of the Andria is anticipated by the plot concocted by the two lovers. So we can see here how Davos is showing off, if you want, and revealing that the very plot, not of another comedy, but of the Andria itself, is unrealistic. It's false. There is a kind of inherent falsity of a comic plot of this very play, which Davos reveals with a meta-theatrical joke. And yet, which I find interesting, and we'll come back on that, this falsity, this lack of realism pleases the playwright and, of course, the audience, which, if you want, acquiesces with this fiction. Terence is therefore not just joking, however, on realism, on the supposed realism of the comic plots. Let's remember, as I pointed out before, that for an author like Donatus, Roman comedy and Terentian comedy in particular is realistic under all point of view, and including the plots. We have many notes in which Donatus praises how realistic, how real are the plots of Terence. And it's not just Donatus, because I found a couple of American scholars in the early 20th century who were very ready to defend the realism of Terence, claiming that they had also witnessed cases of anagnosis in their own life. And yet, as we've just seen in this passage from the Andria, Terence is very clearly exposing the lack of realism of this plot with not many problems. I will now move to another very interesting passage, which is from my own play, to come at last to focus even more to the text I've been working on for many years. That's from a kind of corresponding scene, if you want, to the one we read before. That's from a monologue of the adolescent Clitiphor, who is one of the lovers from the play. How much time do I have? Like half an hour, 40 minutes, something like that. So
yes, I believe that half an hour, it's okay.
Yes, so I will jump a bit, so you can refer to the text on your handout. Essentially, in this passage, you have the young man Clitiphor who is kind of criticizing his own father. In the dialogue which preceded this monologue, we had Kremes, who is the old man of the play, giving a lesson to his own son, and the lesson was learn from the other people. You see that line 221, Clitiphor is quoting what his father has said to him, and what his father said to him is learn from other people, taste the other people's experience, and learn from them what is useful to you. And this is a kind of typical exemplarity framework, if you want, which we have seen is very often associated with comedy itself. You remember the passage we were referring before. If you want to learn how to live yourself, watch comedy, read comedy, so in that way you can understand what is right and what is wrong. But in this particular monologue, Clitiphor again completely dismisses this kind of philosophy from learning of other examples. And again, we find the same very strongly meta-theatrical term, fabulae. You see, again, surdo narret fabulum. The little story, if you want, the comedy which is given to me, is given to a surdo, is given to a deaf man. I'm not listening to him. So you can see here we have Cliti for himself, who is disparaging the supposed typical exemplarity of the fabulae, which, as we've seen, is typical of the reception of Terence. We have another clear example, I think, in the Adelphoe, and this is this passage you find here, number 4b. We have another old man who is called Demia, and Demia in the comedy, if you've read it, is a kind of harsh old man who is criticizing everyone. And in this particular passage, he presents his own philosophy of education, his own educational philosophy, which can be epitomized again with this image of the mirror. The mirror is presented a moral of the mirror. I'm telling other people to look at other lives like as if they were looking into a mirror. And we saw before how this image of the mirror is iconic of the kind of reception of Terence and comedy in generally as champions of realism. And since we know that this image can be dated to the Hellenistic times, to the 3rd and 4th century BC even, it's quite possible that Terence here, or Menander, or both of them, are kind of making fun of this sort of a association between more comedy and the mirror. And we know that Terence is making fun of that because immediately after this moral of the mirror is presented, we have a slave, who is, in this case, the slave Cyrus, the typical iconic comic slave who completely destroys, deconstructs this moralistic view of education, and we may say of comedy in general. So we have seen already some kind of deconstruction already, but we can also focus on another aspect which we see something similar going on. And this is what I call here, as you can see, a number 6 on the handout, is the dangers, the kind of cognitive dangers of realistic entities. What I use with this, I was looking for a clever term. What I mean by realistic entity is something very broad. It's basically any sort of artifact, character, or even just circumstance that looks like another, looks like reality, looks, or perhaps even pretends to be real, but it is not real. So time is running short, so I won't be able to focus on all the passages I prepared for you, but let me focus on one of them in particular, which is the one from 6a from the Eunuchus, which has been the topic of a book by a scholar who has recently passed away, a young scholar who is called Robert Germany, has written a short but beautiful book on this. And as Robert Germany pointed out, the whole of Eunuchus, and in particular this scene, focuses indeed on the danger of comic and more generally of realistic entities. So yes, I won't be able to read the passage, but let me briefly paraphrase for you. We have a young man, again in love, who is called Chaereas, and the young man, has dressed himself like the Eunuchus, the eponymous Eunuchus, because he wants to insinuate himself into the private rooms of the girl that he loves. This impersonation, the text says, is very convincing, and I will say it's very realistic, because we have said on the line 375 in the Eunuchus, the costume he has chosen to dress and the beauty of the guy and the age corresponds perfectly to the expectations about the character that he is impersonating. Eunuchus are expected to be young and beautiful. In fact, the Eunuchus of this play, the real one, is old and ugly. So in this particular case, Chaereas is a very realistic Eunuchus. He's even more realistic than the real one, who is old and ugly. And yet the realism of this impersonation is very dangerous for the girl, because she will eventually be raped by that. If the dangers of the kind of realistic representation are not clear enough, I think Terence makes it even clearer, because he inserts in this very scene, which you find in the handout, a reference to a mimetic entity. And this is a painting which represents the rape of Danae by Jupiter. In the passage which you find in the handout 6a, Chaereas describes him seeing the painting and recognizing himself in the episode depicted in it, and taking it as an exemplum for the behavior that he will soon put in practice. So in this scene, we find, therefore, a kind of mix of different layers of embedded realistic entities. We have a realistic Eunuchus, but not a real one. who is watching a mimetic representation of a mythological event and sees in it a plausible example for his own real behavior. So we see here, I would argue, condensed and deconstructed those two key features of the traditional interpretation of comedy: realism and exemplarity, looking like someone without being one, and by doing that being an exemplar for some other. However, against what we have seen, the traditional positive interpretation, these realistic entities are presented as dangerous for what I will properly call a cognitive point of view, because the girl misjudges Ceres as the eunuchus, and Ceres misjudges a supposedly divine behavior as morally exemplary. I had another example to consider, which is from the Heauton-Timoroumenos. Let me very briefly.
Beppe,
yes.
Be easy. You have time.
Take your time. Okay, so I can take my time. So I don't want to go on for too long. Okay, so I will go. Yes. Thanks for you. If you get bored and you fall asleep, wave and I will move faster. But let me focus on the second example because again, it's from my play, which is very dear to me. And this is
in this case, we can just turn off the camera and take a nap.
Okay, perfect. That's you're very welcome to do that. So the second example is the one at 6b. You can see it's from my play, and if you want, it's the climax, climax plot event of the play. This is when, as again, typically Roman comedy, we have an old man who is Ceres, who is going to be cheated by a slave, who again is called Cyrus. If you want, the whole play, or at least most of the play, has been preparing for this particular event. This is all the plot has been going on and directed to this very point. The details of the rules are quite different, quite intricate, but I will simply point out that at the core of the rules, there is an exploitation, again, of a realistic circumstance. This particular play, again, I won't be able to give you the whole plot, but it is realistic that the prostitute, who is called Bacchus, is having an affair not with the Ceres' son, Cleitophon, but rather with his neighbor, who is called Clinia. In fact, Bacchus, the prostitute, is having an affair with Cleitophon, but according to the way the plot and the rules have been constructed, this is not really realistic. And Cyrus has been enhancing this misleading realism of the situation, as if Clinia is the realistic lover of Bacchus, even if he's not. But Cyrus has enhanced and exploited this situation to the point, which is the one we have here, in which he convinces Ceres, the old money, to give the money to Cleitophon. I think you can see very briefly line 801, 802. We have Cyrus who really asks Ceres to give him the money, to give the money to his own son, which is the whole point of his plan. Ceres has something else in mind. He's not really thinking about it, but he's a kind of clever guy, so he's not very ready to do that. So he asks why I should do that. And the answer of Cyrus is, quia vi debitur mage veri simile id esse, quam ici illi dabit. Why should I do that? Because it will look more very similar, more realistic. Again, we have the same sort of reference to a verisimilitude, to a realism, which is, however, deceptive. This is very clear in this play. It's a beautiful play. I really love it because the whole point of this play is that Cyrus never lies. There is not a single lie in this play of the Heauton-Timoroumenos, apart from one at the beginning, but most of the rules is just about the exploitation of realism. It's not just this particular plays, the one I've seen, but most of plotting and Terentian plays capitalize on the dangers of realisms in the construction of the plots. We have a typical type of comedy, which is the comedy of errors, especially in its variant with the twin motive, which is in fact all revolving on this sort of misunderstanding originating on realistic entities. This particular play, as you remember, if you remember from the Menechmi, we have two twins who look exactly like the same. They are, as you can see, speculum. They are the imago of each other. And yet the whole play is about how cognitively misleading this realism is. And again, we find the same image of the mirror, which in antiquity and already in the Hellenistic times, at the time of Terence, was typically used to describe the whole point of comedy. the same kind of exploitation of realism for comic purposes is found in another typical plot, a Roman comedy, which is the one that you find at 60, the comedy of intrigue. Again, there are many plays. I'm referring, for instance, to the Amphitryon, put you an example in which we have the whole play is an intrigue of the gods, because Mercurius, who is acting like a slave, is helping his own master, who is Jupiter, to seduce a married woman, who is Alcmena, behind the backs of her husband Amphitryon. And in this play, again, the whole point is possible because Jupiter and the god Mercurius in particular have exploited this sort of mirror-like impersonation. And again, I'm referring now to line 442 of the Eunuchus, where again, the same kind of misleading and dangerous, even physically dangerous in this particular play, similarity and realism is compared with a speculum, with a mirror. We can therefore conclude that the section saying that in both Plautus and Terence, realism in the broad sense, in a kind of broad sense of looking like something without being there one, is presented as a very dangerous and very misleading quality. Indeed, it is often equated to what we will call illusionism, and that's number 7 on the handout. And I'm here referring to a very famous passage of the Pseudolus, if you remember, which is very, very important, in which Pseudolus describes his own job, and more specifically the job of the poet, to which his own task is compared. And what does the poet do? Facit illud verisimile, quod mendacium est. So that's, in fact, the whole point of comedy. Not really to present a realistic imitation of reality for the purpose of educating children and students and the audience in general to how to behave, or not even to understand exactly how life is, but just for the sake of fun. And we find again in my own play, as I mentioned already, the kind of extreme variant of this particular topos, and that's number 7b on the handout. This is one of the main monologues of the slave Silus, in which he praised his own skills in the play. It is very typically Roman comedy, as you know, for a slave to praise his own ability. And there are quite often meta-theatrical implications behind that. It's quite often, as we see here, a kind of meta-theatrical allusion, which equates, again, the job of the slave to the one of the comic playwright. In this particular passage, you have Cyrus indeed giving the Palman, the theatrical prize, to his own ruse, which, as already mentioned, in this play is to be able to say always the truth, and yet, by saying always the truth, exploiting the danger of this sort of realistic appearances, bring forward the whole plot. So far, in a way, we have seen how realism can be dangerous and can produce, if you want, tricks and reuses in particular, very comical things, but it's not just about fun. We can see how in Terentian comedy, we also have a deconstruction of realism, also in, if you want, serious version. And I can quote you and make you understand what I mean by that. Another passage from a play, which is number 8a on the handout. And that's at the end of the play, after the anagnosis has happened, after the cheating of the old man has be completed, we have, if you want, an epilogue, a sort of coda. In this kind of coda, we have, again, the slave Cyrus, who managed to convince the young man Clitiphor that he's not the natural son of his parents. Cremes, the old man, is now very upset with his son Clitiphor for having an affair with a prostitute, and he has decided to pretend to disinherit him. Cyrus is very worried about that, so he's coming up with a plan, which is to convince Clitiphor to go to his parents and complain and ask about his own identity. And the whole point of Cyrus' slaves is the one we find in this passage, in which Cyrus managed to convince Clitiphor, as I was saying, that it is very similar, it is realistic that he is not the son of his own parents. You can see how in the passage, if you can see that, yes, line 990 and so on, we have this transition from realism, very similar, to truth, verum dicis. And it is interesting to note that the argument which is put forward by Sears to secure the assent of Fleetifor is evoking the same kind of universality element which is also typical of the reception of comedy as a realistic genre. As we read before in that passage of Donatus, the mirror of comedy is able, if you want, to bring out the forms, the ideas, the universals out of the particular experiences. In this particular passage, we see Sears doing something very similar. You see, omnes matres, all the mothers held their sons, all the mothers are very fond of their sons, and they held them in their misbehaviors. Since your mother does not do so in this particular play, she's not your mother. So we see how we have a kind of misled transformation of verisimilitude, very similar, into truth, which is achieved by a reference to a supposedly universal type of behavior, omnes matres. So in sharp contrast with ancient reception, and Donatus in particular, Terence presents universal realism. You see, very similar, omnes mater. Universal realism as such is an inherently misleading entity, because it results in this particular play in the introduction of a separation between characters, which in this play, the son, Fleetifor, and his parents. And this, again, is another typical comic situation, which we find especially in Terence, which is not the kind of same sort of jocular and funny character that we find in other comedies. It's quite serious. I mean, the alienation between children and parents is a serious situation which needs to be solved. We have many other cases which are similar to this. I put you here, for instance, a reference to the plot of the Echira, which again revolves around, as I put in the handout, an erroneous interpretation of a realistic circumstance under the misleading influence of a supposed universal. But I will move on. For the people who read the Echira, it's clear that the same thing is going on. It is realistic that the one, the culprit of the play is Sostra, the one who has made a mistake is Sostra, because that's the realistic way mothers-in-law normally behave. But in fact, this is not really the case. So I'm now moving to the conclusion. Thanks for bearing with me. And I can conclude, or preliminary concluding, that in Terentian comedy, realism does not have the kind of positive connotation that he has in most of its scholarship. In Terence, the inherent falsity of realism is exposed, its supposed exemplarity is disparaged, and its ignorant cognitive dangers are exploited as means to create comic situations, some serious, some less serious. And yet, as we saw at the beginning, as we've seen in the prologues in particular, realism does remain for Terence an essential formal quality of the genre, which needs to be achieved by the comic playwright. How do we reconcile this contradictory evidence, this apparent contradiction? I've been talking a bit too much, so I won't give you a full article answer, which we can have a chat about later on, but let me give you some brief tentative conclusions to kick off the dialogue. First of all, I think that this kind of apparent contradiction is only a contradiction if we necessarily associate truth and realism. And I refer here realism in this kind of broad sense as an imitation which is transparent, a transparent imitation of reality. But clearly, this association between truth and realism is not the one we find in Terence, and that's not the one that we find in most of the ancient tradition. I don't have the time to talk about Plato or to talk about Platonic schools and philosophy and so on, but it's quite clear that for many of ancient scholarship, or much ancient scholarship, realism imitating in a mirror-like way reality is nothing to do with knowledge, it's nothing to do with exemplarity, it's something false, it's a lie. It's, as we saw before, making a lie look realistic in the passage we quoted. This awareness is very present, the awareness that truth and realism don't really come together. It's an awareness that we find in Roman comedy, also together with the sort of association between the setting realism and the comic genre in particular. I think the meta-theatrical passage of the Pseudolos is clear enough. The comic poet is the one who invents the lie and makes them look realistic. which is in fact also what the iconic comic slave does with his comic inventions. At least according to the plot in Pseudolus, Roman comedy is deceptively realistic. It is realistic, but in a deceptive way, as regards both form and content. But why is that so? Why comedy? Why this is the point of comedy? And this, in a sense, would explain why, on the one hand, realism is a technical requirement of the genre, because that's what the comedy does. So why do we have that? What is the purpose of this deceptive realism, which seems so typical of comedy? First possibility, which is number 7C. Sorry, 7, yes, forget number 9C. So first possibility is to assume a purely hedonistic conception of realism, as you see. We can echo some, even some ancient critics, and say that the purpose of comic realism is just to make people happy, to please the audience, to make fun, to make the audience laugh, to provide, we can say in a more sophisticated way, the sort of self-referential pleasure which is typically associated with a good mimetic artifice. So just like the comic slave invent lies to deceive characters for the pleasure of the audience, so the comic poet invent lies to deceive the audience for their own pleasure, of course, only as long as the dramatic illusion lasts. I do think that plot in comedy can be associated with, yes, I forgot, I put in the handout some ancient pieces of scholarship which somehow repeat this kind of, in a critical way, this kind of hedonistic conception of comedy. People like Marcus Aurelius or Macrobius in antiquity were describing new comedy in particular as an ingenious mimicry, as an ekmimesios philotechnia. So it's just a technical artifice which is completely self-referential. I do think, moving down to number 9D, I do think that plot in comedy can be associated with an hedonistic conception of realism. And I do think that we have some traces of it also in Terence. You remember before we saw Davos saying that this unrealistic plot commentum placket was pleasing to them. I do think that this would be enough to give sense to the kind of contradiction I have identified. Comedies need to be realistic. They need to make very similar lies, realistic lies, because that's the whole point of the genre. That's the feature, if you want, of the technical nature of the genre. But the goal of this kind of technical realism is everything except the communication of truth or exemplarity. Lies are lies if you make them look realistic. I do believe, however, that Terence make a sort of step forward from these conceptions, a kind of step towards a partial reconciliation of realism with truth. Because we have seen today in the passage we've read that Terence reflects on realism not just as a source of entertaining deception, but above all as a sort of unpleasant, serious cognitive misconceptions, an alienation between characters, a rape, and so on. We have seen, therefore, that in Terence comedies, the deception of realism are not all funny or entertaining, but often have, if you want, serious, even gloomy consequences, the kind of consequences that we also find in Menander. In fact, all the comedies of Terence begin with an alienation. In all cases, these alienations originates in some sort of deceiving realism. I don't have the time to go through all of them, but in all cases, there is some kind of element of deceptive realism. And at the end of all these comedies, we get a resolution of this by the exposure of the deception of the realism. We don't have a single comedy of Terence ending with a celebration of the deceptive realism, as many plotting comedies do, like the Pseudolus, for instance, or the Sticus, and many others. At the end of many plotting comedies, we just have a celebration of this. Comedies realistic and deceptively realistic, and we can be very happy about that. In fact, at the end of the comedies of Terence, we have an exposure of this and a resolution. So we can say that Terence comedy self-reflects on the comic dangers of deceptive realism rather than exploits and celebrates them. For both Plautus and Terence, realism is a very comical thing. But while Plautus exploits realism to distill vis comica, to make the audience laugh, Terence also uses it to reflect, to self-reflect on its inherent cognitive dangers. we can say, therefore, there is some sort of wisdom in Terence comedies, and we can, in a way, reconcile a bit with the standard interpretation that we have been deconstructing for the whole of this paper today, saying that there is some sort of truth behind the appearances, the realistic appearances of Terentian comedy. And this is the truth, the paradoxical truth, that appearances are dangerous. I can say, therefore, that Terence comedy is not just about the deceiving mirror of ancient scholarship, as it's not just a mirror, as Donatus and other people say, which only imitates the appearances, and therefore, for other scholars like Terence himself, is problematic. But Terence comedy is also the kind of X-ray mirror, which is the one that the plotting character Periphanes Blues is about, in this beautiful quotation, which I would like to read to you. It would be good if people had mirrors, not just for the sake of their faces, so as to look at the faces in them, but also mirrors with which they could see into the heart of wisdom, the cause sapientiae, so that they could see into the resources of their hearts. So let me conclude this long journey. Thanks for staying with me. We conclude with a short sentence. Ancient scholarship, and let me move down so you can see the short sentence here. So there's really my conclusion, but it's an open conclusion. I'm very happy to discuss. We have seen how ancient scholarship and modern scholarship sees Terence comedy as a mirror reflecting the os, the outer layer of human life, whereas Terence sees his comedy as a mirror self-reflecting on its own inner distortion. It is to say, for Terence, comedy is a sort of two-layered artifact, formed by a speculum oris, which a speculum oris is a mirror of appearances, the mirror of the face, which accurately reflects appearances. That's important because that's a technical requirement. But it's not just a speculum oris, it is also speculum sapientiae, a sort of X-ray mirror, which operates by reflecting on the cognitive dangers on the speculum oris itself. But just as the passage I quoted above, this passage from the Epidicus in the edition of Wolfgang himself, it's printed in many different ways, in different editions. This is certainly not yet the end of the fabula. Thank you very much for listening. I haven't read the chat yet, but if you have any question, I'm very happy to go back to them. Otherwise, please go on. Thank you very much. Sorry for being much longer than expected. Sorry about that.
No, it was amazing, Pepe. We are very pleased. I would say that how it could be in an act of a play. But thank you again for your stimulating talk. Very it put a lot of ideas for us to think about. And I would like just to come directly to the questions and observations. Someone, Gracie, do you see someone in the chat propose some question? Or even if someone now want to make the questions, just take the microphone and fire it.
On our chat, we have many thanks. Thank you, Giuseppe, Neff, George, Lorena, Wolfgang also thank you, and applaud, and yeah, you're being praised.
There is a question. There is a question by Stefani Silva. Professor, do you see realism as verisimilitude? Could Terence not be realistic in his texts, but present a verisimilitude within the play itself? Your microphone, Beppe.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Thank you very much to all. Thanks for these comments. A bit too generous, but thank you very much. I'm glad you liked it. So I would say to Stephanie that here I'll be using the word realism, if you want, as a tag. So to define what I mean by realism is very difficult. I mean, I would like to ask you, what do you mean by realism? What do you mean by verisimilitude? Because quite often we use words that perhaps have different meanings for you than they have meanings for us. So let's say that the way I've been using the word realism today is like a tag, as the kind of tag you put when you have a tweet, for instance, you have a kind of hashtag and so on. And the general idea of realism is anything which kind of presents a kind of association, and I will say a transparent association, so something which can be easily recognized. So for instance, I like Tolkien, and I work on Tolkien. Tolkien is not realistic, and therefore it's the saying that orcs and elves do not exist in the real world. There may be some truth in Tolkien, but that's not what I'm referring to. So here I'm referring to an imitation of reality which is transparent, which is naturalistic. It's like a photography, on the ancient world, like a painting. A painter was trying to reproduce something which was almost indistinguishable from reality. You remember there was this story about this competition between painters, and they were the whole point of the competition was the one who would win the competition was the one that would make impossible for the audience to recognize what was real and who was the painting. So that's what I'm referring to by realism. In that sense, I would like to ask you, what do you mean by verisimilitude? What would be the difference between that? Because at this point, I do think that to a certain extent, there is a kind of distinction between realistic and verisimilitude, but we need to be very clear in the definition. So I would like you to ask Stephanie himself, that's the way I define realism, transparent imitation of reality. But what do you mean by that? What do you mean by realism? What do you mean by verisimilitude? Why do you pose them? What would be the distinction, your idea? So I will ask you a question, if you don't mind.
Stephanie, if you want to answer that.
Okay. Good afternoon, good evening, Professor. Thank you for the answer. Yes, realism and the meaning of the real thing that happen in real life. Yeah, things that happen in real life. But in verisimilitude is something that does not exist in real life. Like, do you say orcs in The Lord of the Rings? Orcs are not real, but in the book, there's a verisimilitude. There's real on the book. There's real on history, on Middle Earth, not on the real life. That's what I mean for realism and verisimilitude. That's
Thank you very
the
much.
difference.
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful point. Thanks for clarifying that, because this is wonderful. So you're now creating a distinction between, if you want, we may call it external realism and internal realism. So in a sense, an external realism is a kind of relation between the world of the comedy, if you want, and the world outside the comedy. Whereas internal realism is kind of poses no connection whatsoever, or at least no transparent connection with the external world, but within the reality of the secondary world or the comic world, there is realism, so everything is convincing. So I would say that for ancient scholarship, for ancient tradition, for the ancient reception of Terence, not down to the 21st century, in Terence there is both external realism and internal realism, but simply because there is not a distinction. So in the standard reception of Terence, not just Terence, but for most of the ancient scholarship, not all the ancient scholarship, but most of the ancient scholarship, you cannot divide the two. In order to have internal realism, you have to have external realism. So the way you assess internal realism, so let's say how convincing is the behavior of a particular character, you need to refer to something which is outside the world of the play. So that's the ancient reception. What I think is that in Terence, they're using your words, Stephanie, so you've gone away, but yeah, you're still there. So using your words, I think that in Terence, there is internal realism, there is verisimilitude, so I agree with that. And there is also a degree of external realism. So at the end of the day, the plays are set in a specific historical context. There is quite a careful attention in imitating real social conventions. There are many references to real historical events, to real places, Athens, Caria, and so on. So I do think there are both of them. That said, I don't think that what really matters to Terence is the first. So I do think that for Terence is more important internal realism rather than external realism. I do think that Terence is more concerned with internal realism, and the external realism, if you want, is just a technical convention. It's just like, okay, in a Roman comedy, we need to have the slave and the prostitute and the old man. And therefore, we need to play with the chains. There was a beautiful book that was called Dancing in Chains. external realism are the chains of the genre. But what Terence really cares is the internal realism. It is for the internal realism, in all its senses, that if you want, the truth and the reality comes through. I hope it was clear enough.
I believe so. Stephanie, do you want to say something? Is she here? I don't know. If it's okay, I think that Rodrigo, do you want to ask some questions? Rodrigo is here.
Thank you, Father. Thank you for the answer. Okay, that's very good.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Yes, I'm here, but I really enjoyed the talk, but I don't really have any questions at the moment. I was just thinking about the passage. I think it's in Andrea, but the thing is, it's been a long time since I don't work with Terence, and I really love him, and I think I agree with most of what you said, Giuseppe. I remember that small passage in, I think it's Andrea, where the old man, you probably talked about that, but I'm trying to do some other stuff here at the same time. But there's this passage which is really, really striking for me, in which the old man, I think it's Kremes, I don't remember his name right now, he kind of distrusts the plot that the slave is supposedly scheming against him, because he mentions the fact that the Virgo is screaming inside, and she's actually about to, I'm not sure if you talked about that, I'm sorry if I'm repeating.
No.
He says something like, well, it's very convenient for you that she is giving birth exactly right now, so this is the proof that you're trying to set me up. And it's actually happening, the birth. And what's funny is exactly the fact that Terence seems to be mocking the conventions of the genre, in which you have to have a Virgo giving birth on stage, but actually she's not being seen. And so this is, for me, one of the examples of the things that you were mentioning, and I really enjoyed your presentation. This is one of the things I really love about Terence. So thank you very much for your talk, and I'm sorry for my confused comment.
Thanks, Rodrigo. Actually, your comments are not confused at all. They're actually very, very useful. Thank you very much. Yes, I did not talk about the particular passage. I could even try to share it with you, but it's at the end of the Andria, and it's interesting because in the same passage, there is a metatheatrical reference, fabulam inceptat. So we saw the same sort of word coming back again. What I found very interesting, and again, is that this is at the end of the play. So the passage we read today is at the beginning of the play, if you want. The other one is at the end of the play, and Simo is wrong. So the old man is actually wrong, as you said, because in fact, that's what's happening. So we can see how we start from, if you want, the deconstruction of a comedy, but then at the end of it, actually that unrealistic thing becomes true. And in fact, it's very complex what Terence is doing, because it's like adding layer to layer. So when you think you have got to the point of saying, okay, that's what Terence thinks. So Terence thinks these all things are unrealistic, and he's just making fun of it. But then the very fact that Simo at the end of the play needs to be corrected, and at the end of the way, in a sense, there is a typical trope, there is a catastrophe to a certain extent, or at least a change of personality, which is typical in Menander, which is typical in Terence, and the guy has to learn that actually, in some cases, unrealistic situations are actually true. And his own skepticism, which is characterizing for the beginning of the play, the skepticism, which is the one I also have when I read comic comedy, of course, is in fact not so correct. And that's why I would say that Terence is very complex writer, because it never stops. He never stops adding layers of complexity. So thank you very much, actually, for your comment, Rodrigo, which was wonderful. Thank you very much.
For your talk. Really enjoyed it.
I only have
Someone
one,
else?
if I may.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your talk as well. It was very interesting. I just thought about the term danger of realism, because I was wondering whether one should consider who's in danger, because there's a sympathy of the audience. And maybe the victims of the intrigues are in danger of falling for realism, but at the same time, for example, the slave has the sympathy of the audience. So I guess this use of the term sympathy is a little bit difficult. From my point of view, I would differ it a little bit. So regarding the sympathy of the audience.
Yeah, I agree very much. So yes, I don't think that the sympathy of the audience is correct, because I agree with you. So I didn't know why they said that, but if I said that, please, no, I don't think that the sympathy is correct, because in Terence is not an author in which if you want, the kind of, how can we call this, the relationship between the audience and the characters is so clear. So for instance, in Menander and Plautus, the audience are given all the information they need from the very beginning, and then they follow the characters as they discover what the audience already know from the beginning. In Terence, it is not like that. In Terence, in fact, there is no prologue which says what's going to happen from the beginning. There are some hints to what's going to happen. There are some kind of hierarchy, epistemological hierarchy. So the audience always know a bit more than the character, but it's not always like that. And also, the sympathy of the audience keeps changing. So, for instance, in the Eurytimurumenos, you start liking the old man, Kremes, then you start hating him because he's not really a nice guy, but then at the end of the play, you start liking him again. So it's always very difficult for Terence to understand exactly what are the victims of realism, who are the true victims of this realism. And I will say, but again, perhaps I don't have the time to elaborate too much on this, but very briefly, that's what I say, that the audience themselves are victims of the dangers of realism. So I do think that in this play, most of the plays of Terence, all the characters in the play and the audience themselves, at a certain point and to a certain extent, fall victim of misbehavior. And that's very typical in the Eurytimurumenos, because, for instance, we start thinking that the whole plot is about the old man Menedemus, the Eurytimurumenos, and Clinia. We are tricked into this, and in a way it's realistic to believe that, because that's the title of the play, that's what we have in the first scene. But in fact, after a few hundred lines, we see that the plot is going to a completely different direction. And we can see how, as we saw before, there is a very strong link between realism and expectations. In the ancient world, what is realistic is what fulfills the expectation. That's what Donatus keeps saying. How good is Terence because he managed to fulfill completely the expectation. There is some kind of universals within us, universal expectations, that when they are fulfilled, then realism is achieved. But Terence plays a lot with expectations. Terence likes raising expectations and then destroys expectations. So in this particular way, I do think, but we can discuss that, in a sense, there is a kind of problem with the realism, even in the way Terence deals with his own audience. That's the beginning of an answer, but thanks for your comment, because DOP is a big thing.
Thank you very much for pointing that out.
Beppe, let me ask you if you think that Terence, in this way, could be laughing of those in audience who took the examples from comedy as a real learning.
I am absolutely. We say Plautus does it. So because we know there is the passage, I remember which play both of you may remember, which says, all these people, they come to, I think it's the end of Trenunus, they come to this play because they want to learn, but they go back home and they misbehave as was them before. So that's really, in Plautus, we have something very, very clear of that. In Terence, we have something similar, as we saw in the passage from the Adelphoe. But I think that there is an element in which Terence wants to teach a lesson. So I don't think that, I would say, if Terence makes fun, he will say makes fun of a reduced or stereotypical version of realism, of a kind of simple, easy version of exemplarity of realism. I do think that Terence comedy is much more moral than Plautus. Is much more moral than Plautus, whether because that's what he wants it to be, or whether because that's what his original were, Menander, and he did not have the guts to change too much. We don't know. I don't care, to be honest. I just look at the text as it is. But in the text as it is, we can see that there is a kind of moral dimension. But it's a moral dimension which is at the level, which is not at the surface level. Is, if you want, it's at the core, it's at the heart, it's at the depth. So if there is a realism and exemplarity in Terence, it's deep, it's not superficial. If Terence is making fun, but of the superficial realism and the superficial exemplarity, I would say.
Nice, thanks. Someone else want to put some question, or in the chat there is something? Gracie, did you see something?
No, thank you, Giuseppe. Thank you, Beethoven, also
so there is a question about the PDF of Terence, but I cannot say it. But you can find PDFs of Terence on the web, but I'm not allowed to say where.
Yes, you're right. Yeah. Just the last thing is a technical question, Beethoven, about the certificate.
We send email. We will send an email afterwards.
Okay. Yeah. So, thank you so much, Giuseppe.
Thanks to, sorry, I don't want to, but there is a question by Renata, which is a pity. Sorry, can I address the question of Renata, because I'm sorry to leave it like that very briefly.
Okay.
So Renata is asking, castigat redendum more. So here is, this is is referring to satire, of course. So this is the castigat redendum mores is the standard description of satire, if I'm not mistaken. I wouldn't use the word castigare. Okay, I think it's a bit too strong for Terence. So I would say temper. So I think that there is an element of verbal violence, which is, if you want, implied by castigare, the verb castigare, which you don't find in Terence. It's more tempering, if you want. So I do think that there is a connection between comedy and satire, of course, but it's not the same kind of thing, I would say. There's something a bit different. But another big topic. Sorry for dragging it along, but I didn't want to leave the question unanswered.
Yes, there is another question by Beatrice.
Oh, yes, coming now. Yes, okay, so that's another big question, of course, Beatrice. So it's a long question, but to put it simple, okay, Terence and Plautus have been described by some as the very first rhetorical text of the Roman tradition, if you want, native rhetoric. And the reason why is that because Terence in particular, but also Plautus, is full of rhetorical references. Again, just to give you an example of my own play, the character Cremes speaks like an orator. Not only speaks like an orator, but he describes himself as an orator. The prologue of the Otontium begins with the prologue speaker saying, I am an orator, I'm going to give you an oratio, and you are going to listen to this. So the connection between comedy and Terence, in particular rhetoric, is so strong, not only strong, but is very explicit. And in the commentary, I very often pointed out very close connection between, if you want, the teaching of rhetorical teachers present in Rome at the time, in the 60s of the 2nd century BC, with what Terence is doing. To give one example, in the prologue of the Otontium, the prologue speaker saying, I'm going to speak in utranquem partem. And in utranquem partem, on both sides of the argument, is a technical word for the kind of rhetorical technique used by the Peripatetics, for instance, but also by the skeptics of the academy of the time. That said, that one thing. So yes, there is a connection, there is a relation. The kind of relation which is more interesting for Quintilian is to do with what I will call ethopoeia. Ethopoeia is a rhetorical technique, which is the technique of creating characters. And this dates back to Theophrastus in particular. Theophrastus was a student of Aristotle, and Theophrastus wrote a book which is called The Characters, which is a collection of character sketches which will develop later on in ethopoeia. And ethopoeia were standard rhetorical exercises. So if you have if you're a rhetor, at any time you will learn how to be a rhetor by creating a character, because a rhetor, as we know for Lysias, for instance, will present a convincing characterization of the defendant. Since there is a clear connection between Theophrastus and comedy, because there is quite clear that Menander and Theophrastus were somehow related, and there is even a tradition according to which Menander was a student of Theophrastus. And since comedy was all about the characters themselves, and since in Theophrastus, many of the characters of Theophrastus are names of comic characters, we see how there is another link between new comedy and rhetoric from the very beginning of it. So these two strands, one which is more specific, Roman comedy and Roman rhetoric, and the other which is more general, which is new comedy and ethopoeia of the rhetorical tradition, that's the connection of the two. And this connection made the comedy of Terence and new comedy in general attractive to people like Quintilian.
Oi.
Okay. Beatriz is thanking.
Good.
So, good. Someone else, or we could finish. 1, 2, 3. Yes, thanks. I think that nobody else has any question or observation. So I must thank you again, Beppe, for your brilliant and stimulating talk today. Very define this new idea of deconstructing some understanding so much held in our beliefs. So thank you very much. You put us to think about that. And I must thank you, all of you that attended today from many places, as I said, in Brazil or outside Brazil. And if you want to say some last words, we can finish after that, Beppe.
So thank you very much to all. Thanks for all the questions. It's a wonderful to see so many people interested in this. So I'm very grateful to you. Thank you very much.
So thank you. Bye for everyone. Thank you.
Bye
again.
everyone. Thank you very much.
Bye.
See you
You can
next time.
stop recording.